Welcome to episode 40 of The Expert and the Idiot. Today I'm talking to Justin Julander of Australian Addiction Reptiles. Justin is an associate research professor at Utah State University. He is co-author of 4 books. Let's see if I can name them all off. We got the Complete Carpet Python, the More Complete Carpet Python, Knobtail Geckos, Green Tree Pythons, and Antaresia. So 5.
Yeah.
I counted the carpets as 2.
Yeah.
As one,
they're pretty different books, so I think that's warranted.
Yeah, they are. And I still haven't even finished the More Complete. There's so much there to digest. I find that I keep going back to the same sections. You know, I'm kind of obsessed with jungle carpets, and so I find myself just going back over certain areas and all that. You're also the host of the Reptile Fight Club podcast. Yeah, which is I think maybe it should be renamed the Polite Educated Conversation Club. It's you hear Fight Club and it's almost you picture something more sensational, but you guys are so respectful, and I really love the podcast. I find that, like, if we're driving somewhere as a family, my 2 boys and my wife, that's the podcast I'll put on, because I can totally trust that it's going to be family friendly. You know, that you guys very rarely, have foul language and things like that, which is awesome. And we listen to it so much that my oldest son now, when he finds something, some roadkill, he refers to it as DOR. He's like, I found a DOR, corn snake or rattler or whatever,
Awesome. Yeah.
So we're big fans of that as a family. And so how did your addiction with Australian species and snakes in general start? How did you get into them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like everybody else, or maybe not everybody, but most people, into dinosaurs as a kid, moved on to snakes and reptiles and amphibians as a young kid. My dad would take me on a lot of backpacking trips, and I'd always want to go to the desert because that's where I thought all the cool reptiles were out in the desert. I still lean towards the desert a bit these days as well, but so all the backpacking trips, I was always kind of had my eye out for whatever reptile we could find. So I've got a lot of fun stories of chasing down and catching reptiles. And then I had really supportive parents. My mom and dad let me bring whatever home, so I'd have rattlesnakes or lizards or whatever, turtles out in the yard and stuff like that. So they were very supportive. Even let me get a big Burmese python when I was 10, 12-year-old, somewhere around
wow
there. So
that's impressive.
Really cool parents. Yeah. they were very supportive. And then just kind of blossomed from there. But I think for Australian reptiles, I'd always kind of you'd see a frilled lizard or something like that on a nature program, and just thought that was the coolest thing ever. And so I really got interested in Australia just from some of the unique, bizarre reptiles that they had over there. And then that I saw a picture of a centralian python, the Morelia bredli, that was sitting on a rock cliff, out in central Australia somewhere. And just thinking, if I could see a python on my backpacking trips, that would be the ultimate. So I really got interested in the carpet python and started looking into those a lot. Got onto, the early Morelia python forums back in the day, and just made a lot of good friends that I'm still friends with to this day. Rob and Eric and Chuck and all the old school reptile guys, Nick and just really got heavy into jungle carpets. Now, when I got married, my wife's like, I don't feel comfortable with snakes in the house. And so I had a bunch of snakes that I kind of gave away. A couple of them were illegal anyway. You're not allowed to keep rattlesnakes in Utah. I found that out, so I gave those away. But So I kind of had to start her off easy. So I got into some colubrids. I got some little milk snakes, that were cute and tiny and colorful. And so she said, "Oh yeah, that's fine." And then I talked her into a jungle carpet. And then I said, "This is one of the smaller carpet pythons. They're really beautiful." And then it just kind of blossomed from there. And she's been very supportive too. Like, I think she got over her fear pretty quick and just cares enough to let me kind of follow my passion, and has always been very supportive. She was the one that said, you need to go to Australia before kids are in braces and things like that. Go now while the kids are still a little young and they don't need as much stuff. So that was really nice of her. So I got to go over to Australia for the first time in 2010. So
wow, that's awesome.
She even took care of the snakes while I was away. So
that's really awesome.
She's definitely a keeper.
Now, how many times have you been to Australia now?
Somewhere, maybe eight, something like that, I think.
Do you highly recommend it for anybody that's passionate about the Australian species?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, go with so when I went over there, I was thinking, man, I'm just going to see reptiles everywhere. I flew into Cairns for my first trip up in northeastern Queensland, on the coast. And I was just thinking, I'm going to get this car. I'm going to drive around and find just reptiles everywhere. And, it's not necessarily quite that easy, I guess. You still have to put in some work and some effort to it. But that first night I saw, I got leaf-tailed gecko, the cornutus, the big one up there. Got a death adder on my drive down from the tablelands. Got a few, other frogs and geckos and lizards and things. So it was, the trip ended up being fantastic, and I saw a ton of cool stuff. We went up to Iron Range, saw green tree pythons, frilled lizards, all the kind of magical stuff up there. And then went to Central Australia, saw ackies, saw gillans, saw cool reptiles down there, big king brown, things like that. So it was a really nice trip, and I actually went with my dad, so I got to spend that time with my dad out in the outback, which is
that's awesome.
Pretty much a dream come true. And then after that, with writing the books, I got pretty lucky to get invited back to give like talks and things like that. And I've been very fortunate to go over a few times, with sponsors or whatever paying my way, so I could go give a talk or, and so that's led to a lot of fun experiences, good friends. I'm still really good friends with a lot of the people that I've met over there, and really have had a nice time hanging out in Australia. So yeah, that's definitely awesome. my go-to place for herping. And sometimes I wonder if I'm, focused too much on Australia, if I should go check out some other areas, but there's just so many targets I still need to find that just keeps bringing me back.
Yeah. And there's just so much there to love, so many awesome pythons, and it's an incredible place.
And it's the size of the U.S. So, there's so many different areas you can go to. I was never really that interested in South Australia, but then I got, I had this, after writing the More Complete Carpet with Nick, I thought, I need to go try to find some Gammon Ranges carpet pythons. And so I went out there and looked for them and stuff, and didn't find any, but I really fell in love with South Australia. I thought, this is a really cool place, and found some cool stuff. Missed all my big targets, but found some really cool things that were definitely worth the trip, and just seeing the landscape and kind of being in there and searching. So yeah, it's there's just a lot of cool places over there. So I haven't exhausted my searching yet, so I'll probably do a few more trips before I branch out.
That's awesome. So something that I think about a lot, and I'm excited to talk to you about, is intergrades.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard, so there's people that are in the hobby that are breeding coastals to diamonds, right, and saying this is an intergrade, and then there's people that are saying that's totally wrong. It's not what an intergrade is. An intergrade is its own thing. And then in my mind, I'm thinking, what is an intergrade? Is there, obviously there's no, and I talked a little bit with Nick about this. There's no clear it's not like they're separated by a body of water or a mountain range that, goes up to some absurd altitude that they can't cross or anything like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be, is there sort of a, like a spectrum of intergrade where it goes coastal, more coastal, intergrade, but still more leaning coastal into more pure intergrade that's breeding with other intergrades into intergrades with diamonds, and then it kind of goes in that direction. I mean, how does that work? And is an intergrade the same thing across the board, or are you going to find ones that lean genetically in one direction or the other on that spectrum? If it is a spectrum, I'm curious how that works.
No, I think what you said is pretty spot on. I mean, technically, the definition of an intergrade is the breeding of two subspecies of the same species, right? So, as it currently stands, diamond pythons are Morelia spilota spilota, and coastal carpets are Morelia spilota mcdowelli. And so, if Morelia spilota mcdowelli breeds with a Morelia spilota spilota, it's an intergrade. Now, if a diamond python bred with, say, a green tree python, that would be a hybrid, because they're two different species, and they've evolved on their own evolutionary trajectory. They're definitely different things, and so that's a hybrid. So I guess to differentiate a hybrid from an intergrade, a subspecies cross, that's where intergrade kind of came to play. So if I guess people in captive setting breeding a diamond to a coastal, technically that's an intergrade, or a jungle to a Darwin, depending on where the jungle's from, could be definitely an intergrade. So that's kind of, I guess, the technical term for breeding subspecies together. Now, naturally occurring, we see the one you referred to, the intergrade between coastal carpets and diamond pythons, and those southern coastals are pretty genetic distinct, have a lot of distinctness from the diamond pythons, and diamond pythons probably should be a different species from the other carpets, just my opinion, I guess. So those are pretty big crosses, and I think that's kind of the key factor of that intergrade zone, is that like you said, it's kind of a gradation from coastal to diamond, and so you see all sorts of things in between, and when you're deep into the center of the intergrade territory, it's just intergrades breeding with intergrades, and it's kind of its own thing. Whereas, like you said, if you move further north, you're going to have more coastal blood in there, and if you move further south, you'll have diamonds. And I'm sure that an intergrade that moves into contact with the diamond python is probably going to try to mate with the diamond, or vice versa, kind of thing. So nature is very dynamic, and is not a simple defined thing like we like to make it. And so that's where the difficulty arises, is we like to say this is this, and then nature goes and proves us wrong, or changes the story or whatever. So if indeed diamond pythons were different species from coastal carpets, and say we changed it to Morelia spilota and Morelia mcdowelli, then you'd have a hybrid zone, I guess, and that's documented in nature as well. There's all sorts of things. We like to put labels on things, and so that's kind of what we're doing here, is just kind of slapping a label on it. And most biologists and taxonomists don't even really believe much in subspecies, and so you have other terms like race, or where I know Scott Eiper really likes the term race, and so you've got different races of carpet pythons found in different areas. I kind of tend to prefer locality. I like locality because if you're in the certain spot, this is kind of what you're looking at. It's rarely mixing around too much, at least within a human lifetime. So I can kind of comfortably say, if you're in this area, this is what you're looking at for the most part. And we never know what the taxonomists are going to do. For example, we had one wide-ranging species, the green tree python, right? Morelia viridis. And then I think a lot of herpetoculturalists as well as herpetologists probably knew there was more to it, and there were other species of green tree python. They all look pretty similar, but if you look at the finer details, you can see some differences in tail structure, head structure, things like that. And finally, they did the genetic work, and they named the 2 different species and actually threw in a few subspecies as well, which was kind of interesting because the authors of that paper typically didn't really mess with subspecies. So that was kind of interesting to see them do that. But it's just kind of a way to kind of tell the story of what's going on. And so if you thought, oh, I've just got one species, and so you're breeding this to that and this to this, and all these crazy designer chondros, you've got these weird looking things that come out of the breeding between like an Aru and a Biak, and you have this crazy mix. Well, that's because it's a hybrid, and hybridization usually results in kind of funky outcomes, and especially when you get into the F2 generation. So we never know where the needle is gonna move. So if you're breeding just kind of it's this and this, that's why I kind of tend to like localities, because if you breed within your locality, you're probably not gonna be making hybrids unaware. So that's kind of the way I lean, but to each their own. And frankly, my buddy Ben Morrill, we were business partners back in the day. He's a geneticist and just a really bright guy, but he would always say, once you take it out of the wild, you change its evolutionary trajectory. So it's no longer technically, that species anyway, because you're determining who it breeds and you're determining what kind of conditions and environment it gets. So you're moving it out. So technically it stops belonging to that species that it was in once you take it out of the wild. I always thought it was kind of a fun, paradigm to think about, but
oh yeah. Well, I mean, you got to figure how many animals are being assist fed and things like that. Just animals that would be dead AF out in the wild.
and somebody says, oh, I think they should look like this, or this would be neat if we had an all yellow one or something. And so they start selecting for all the yellow ones, and then you have all of a sudden a yellow one that is not representative of the population, but it's technically still that animal, but you just changed its trajectory to make it look like something. I guess jungles kind of did that a little bit. I mean, you can still find pretty stellar looking jungles. I was watching a YouTube video the other day, and they came, I think it was, I can't remember. Anyway, they came across a jungle carpet, and it was absolutely gorgeous, just beautiful yellow. I mean, it's one that you'd pay a lot of money for in captivity, that nice yellow color. So they are out there in the wild, despite what some people think, but they're not the majority. They're definitely a minority. So.
Now, have you seen jungles out in the wild, and what did they look like when you saw them?
Yeah, I've seen just two jungle carpet pythons in the wild. I think I don't think I've seen more than that. But the first one was kind of muddy brown, not very exciting looking. It was up in the tablelands near Atherton, kind of muddy, blah looking jungle carpet that you might not get too excited about. The second one was down. Oh, where was that? Down a bit further south, closer to the coast, and it was a nice looking animal. It had a lot of yellow in it and kind of all this netting and stuff. I thought it was a really attractive animal. Pretty good size, really well natured. Like the first one was really pissy, always striking and trying to take a swing. This one was just calm. I picked it up, held it, posed for some pictures with it, took a bunch of pictures of it, and never tried to strike or anything. So I think you run the gamut, and I think those were kind of the the top of the line versus the bottom of the line to some extent, as far as
poor brown snake.
I mean, there's some that are brown or reddish colored that are actually really nice looking. So I think that's one of the things we tried to highlight in the book, was bringing out the variety. And that's really one of the coolest things about carpet pythons, is you have such a broad variety of different looks in the wild. And it's kind of funny because, you know, we of course our supply is a little bit limited, and the gene pool we have is a little limited. So of course we're going to wind up bottlenecking with, you know, one or two different looks of jungle carpets, you know, in captivity after years of line breeding and not having much new blood come into the play. And so it makes sense that, and like I said before, people get the idea of, oh, this is how I want jungles to look, and then everybody kind of jumps on the bandwagon, and then you have one look for jungles.
Yeah.
And that makes it a little difficult. And so one of the first kind of, you know, people would, we were always really judgy about, oh, that doesn't look like a jungle, or that's not how a diamond looks, or that's not a pure coastal because it looks like this. And then you go over to Australia and you see these things in the wild, and there's a huge difference in range of appearances and colors and patterns and all sorts of stuff. I was down in Brisbane area, and we found a coastal on Mount Glorious, the road up to Mount Glorious. Found this nice little coastal carpet python, and it looked like a jungle. It had bright yellow bands, and, you know, crazy head pattern and all sorts of stuff. So, I mean, like if you found that in you know, northern Queensland, you'd be like, oh, this is the nicest jungle I've seen. And it was a coastal, well within coastal territory. So, you know, it's hard to say really what does a coastal or a jungle or a, you know, diamond or Darwin look like. And, you know, kind of there was another example of carpet python found up in the Iron Range, and it looked just like a Darwin carpet. And so, you know, just those kind of observations and, you know, seeing more wild animals. And I think as people started herping more and posting photos to, you know, online, our knowledge of what was out there grew. And so we didn't have that simplistic view of, oh, this is what a jungle looks like, or this is what a coastal looks like. You know, people will post a picture of a wild diamond python and people will criticize them. Oh, that's a hybrid, or that's an intergrade. Like, no, it's a wild diamond that I photographed well within diamond python territory. So, you know, that kind of thing, that was one of the goals of the book, is try to dispel that attitude of this is what this looks like, or this is what, you know, that looks like. So that, you know, again, that's the beauty of carpet pythons, is there's so much diversity and different phenotypes within the same populations even. So
it's pretty wild in the hobby when you see people that cross the diamonds with coastals or jungles, and it ends up being, you know, whatever, 75% diamond. It looks like a pure diamond. I mean, you know, you could look at it and be like, oh, that's the most exceptional diamond I've ever seen. And then, oh, geez, it's been, you know, crossed. I had no idea. Yeah. It's pretty wild. How do you feel about that in the hobby? How do you feel about people that are making, you know, intergrades or crosses?
Mm-hmm. I mean, on one hand, it's snakes in a box. You know, it's not going to really save the wild populations or anything. And I think for everybody breeding those hybrids or intergrades or whatever, most of the people are probably not doing that. I think, you know, you see differences in different areas of the hobby. You know, some people are ultra conservative, never cross, never try, you know, never mix anything, only breed, you know, snake from this specific corner of a road in West Texas to this specific snake that you found, you know, within a half a mile of that snake, you know, that kind of dogmatic fundamentalism. And then you have other people like, it's, you know, it's a green snake, just breed all of them together and who cares, you know, it's just snakes in boxes. So I don't necessarily have like a dogmatic side necessarily. I do tend to prefer to keep, you know, things kind of locality type or at least, you know, what we know or can know, because a lot of times the information we got in the beginning was faulty, and so you might have been told it was from this area or that area, but you can never really know for sure, you know, unless you collected it yourself. And so I think I do my best to try to keep it that way, but I'm sure there's probably some mixing that went on back in the day, or, you know, that kind of thing. But I try to keep, you know, at least species level pure, probably subspecies level pure. And sometimes we don't necessarily have a choice. You know, you just have kind of a like I call them captive lineages. You've got a captive lineage of jungle carpets, and that's probably a mixing of a lot of different localities from within the range of jungle carpets, and maybe even based on our latest taxonomic thoughts on carpet pythons that we laid out in the complete carpet python, maybe different subspecies mixing in there too, because we kind of drew a line where we said, okay, this is where jungle carpets stop, and this is where the, I guess, northern carpets, Darwin's, Papuans, and the northern Queensland carpets, kind of what we call variegata. Those all kind of come into play after that. So, but that's always hard to draw that line for sure. But that's kind of what we came up with. And I mean, it makes sense because the same line is drawn for a lot of different species, and there's a lot of shared characteristics between northern Queensland and southern New Guinea, and also over into the Northern Territory. As I'm sure Nick talked about, the Pleistocene and the Ice Age and the rising or the lowering of the sea levels to show land and mixing of genetics and things like that. Now, how long do they have to be separated to have their own evolutionary trajectory? And, with that, all that dynamic thing in play, of course, it's impossible to draw a line or to set things in stone. And so you just have to say, here's what it is now. And so, I mean, there are differences, of course, between some of those things that we're kind of lumping together. And I don't know if I'm necessarily a lumper or a splitter, but it is, I guess, to recognize, okay, this comes from this area, this comes from this area. I'm going to kind of keep them that way. I'm not going to, just because we call Papuans and northern Queensland carpets and Darwin carpets all variegata, it doesn't mean I'm going to breed my Darwin to a Papuan carpet or something. So
sure.
That's
and gelatins are the same too, right?
Yeah, that's that northern Queensland population. Okay. Yeah, so gelatin's kind of the southern end of the distribution. So, of course, there's probably some mixing or intergradation, especially when you throw people into the mix. And I heard that wildlife officials in Cairns area, if they confiscated a jungle carpet, they would release it on this road. And so you might have had carpet pythons collected from a lot of different areas, and then they just confiscate them and put them on this road. And so you have this mix match whatever of a lot of different or jungle carpet pythons in quotes released at this site. So you had some unnatural genetic assisted mixing there. Man,
now what is it? What makes something either a subspecies or a species? So like it's Morelia spilota, right? And then you have all these subspecies. Is it because their scalation is the same? And so since that's all identical, then it's just a different paint job or locality that is separating the subspecies. Because, like I look at when I was first, I'm really into short-tail pythons right now, and they're all their own thing, right? Because they have different scalation around the eyes and things like that. So is it similar with carpet pythons?
Well, I mean, I guess this is similar with everything. Taxonomy is kind of an interesting science where each group of, or even, like say carpet pythons or pythons in general, Australian pythons, somebody kind of takes a liking to that group of reptiles, and that taxonomist is going to make the rules for that. And it's just based on what they think or what the data draws them to conclude. Now, for example, they had that recent revision of the Antaresia group where they lumped in Simpson's pythons with children pythons. And I completely disagree with that move. And I think it's completely nonsensical in some ways. But I can see, maybe the Stimsons in Queensland are very similar, or maybe into the Northern Territory are very similar to children's pythons, and it's really hard to distinguish between the two. So maybe there was some precedent for that to make those specific groups of Stimson's pythons, but they went the extra mile and said, no, all Stimson's pythons throughout all Western Australia, Central Australia, and Eastern Australia, we're just going to call them all children's. And I thought their data showed a distinctness between the Western Stimsons in Western Australia and the others. And we know there's lots of different biogeographical barriers in that, within that range. I mean, Stimsons cover a huge range all the way across Australia from, you know, the east, almost to the east coast, all the way to the west coast. So to say, yeah, they're one thing just seemed very simplistic in my mind, and kind of, so, I mean, they were obviously basing their conclusion on their data and a certain species concept. The problem is there's multiple species concepts. And so it's very difficult to say, you know, everybody has to use this species concept, because not all groups of animals behave the same. For example, with mammals, the kind of rule of thumb is if you bred two, you know, things together, if they created a hybrid, then they were different species. If they, or if they're, sorry, if they created a non-viable or non-reproductive, a sterile mix of the
like
two.
Like a mule.
Yeah, a mule is sterile, so therefore horse and donkey are different species. So they kind of use that as a rule of thumb. Of course, that doesn't apply necessarily to reptiles. You can breed different species, complete different species together and get fertile offspring. And so, you know, the rules that apply to reptiles don't necessarily apply completely to mammals. I mean, you can have some things that do. So I, you know, just the complexity of it, I guess, and the frustration to say, this group thinks this, and so that's dogma, is, I think that's a misunderstanding that a lot of people have with taxonomy, is just because a paper's published doesn't mean you have to agree with it or go along with it. That's just their interpretation of the data. I could look at the same set of data and get a completely different interpretation. You know, I'm not a taxonomist and I don't understand all that stuff. Maybe I know enough to have somewhat of an opinion, but other taxonomists might look at that and go, oh, that's insane. Why would you think, why would you come to that conclusion? So, you know, and it's always changing. I mean, this may change in another 5 or 10 years and we'll have it back to Stimsons, or they might name another species. Now, the same group that lumped all of Stimsoni in with children also split out subspecies of spotted python and then made the southern New Guinea form a complete species, which is, you know, just insane considering their other move with the other. So I don't know if they just wanted to slap a name on something, and you know, they couldn't do that with Stimsoni because they were already named, so they just lumped them together. Maybe down the road they'll try to bring them back or something. I don't know, but who knows? And you know, funding is a challenge for taxonomy. A lot of people aren't necessarily just going to fund something so you can go out and name something. So that's a little different. But I think with the advent of genetics, where we can analyze the DNA sequence and find differences, it's helpful. But at the same time, you know, what areas do you look at? Which areas do you hold to be more important, you know, in regards to changing and evolution than others? There's a lot of sequence, and you know, that's really hard to compare. You know, you can't just say, okay, I have the full sequence of each of these snakes and I'm going to compare them and show all these differences, and you know, just working out what all those differences mean and what's important and what's not important. That's a huge challenge. So we're still kind of on the early days of genetic analysis, I think, in some ways, although we have identified a lot of good areas where, you know, you can show this area is highly variable as the animal changes over time. But again, you know, that's kind of what we're looking at, is whoever gets the inkling to do that work and who wants to work with that group of animals, they're the ones that kind of make the rules or say what's what. So we just kind of go along with it sometimes, but other times we can say, nah, I'm not going to do that. I don't agree with that change.
So it seems like it's sort of unscientific science. Like it's
a little bit. I mean, you know, there still are theories, and you know, like I said, there's different models of how things work, and that's ever changing too. You know, we could have a taxonomy for our taxonomy, where, but what I guess what frustrates me is there's no kind of rule, and I understand, yeah, there, you know, we know that not all rules apply to each group the same, but at the same time, there should be something that's just a base level of, you know, if you see this kind of difference, then that means it's a different species, but it's just open to interpretation. I guess that's the challenge. And I think, you know, I maybe dodged your question a little bit where, yeah, you know, obviously morphology and isolation in their range and things like that come into play when you're describing species. And I guess that was the idea of these authors with the Antaresia, is they said, well, there's overlap between children's and Stimson's, so we can't say that they don't mix genetically, and they're fairly close genetically anyway, so we're going to call them all the same species.
Wouldn't that just be an intergrade zone?
That's or a hybrid zone, because they're different species, right?
Yeah,
and
that's
right.
right.
I mean, obviously different species overlap, and they completely ignored the pygmy banded python, that's or pygmy Stimsons, as some people call them, over in northern Queensland. They're completely different from spotteds and Stimsons, which they overlap in range with, but they didn't include those in the analysis or anything like that. So I thought that was kind of a missed boat there. I think they even had a data point for one or two of them in the paper, which were way out there, way different, but they didn't acknowledge that. So it's kind of strange. But you know, the spotteds overlap with these pygmy banded pythons. They don't breed, they don't interbreed, they don't cross, but there's no indication that they couldn't or that they never do, you know, that kind of thing. That's the hard thing, is to say, oh, this never happens or this always happens. It just doesn't work in nature.
So so that's maculosa, and what's the pygmy banded?
It's undescribed. So it's
wow.
Python, you know, Antaresia species. So
geez.
So there, and we included those in the Antaresia book, the complete children's python book, as something unique, something different. I found a couple of them in the wild. I went out to, you know, the interior of northern Queensland, and found a couple out by this little lake. Found one on the road, almost. So I got out of the car to look at this python. I was all excited, and I forgot to put the car in park. And so I'm sitting there taking pictures of the car, this pygmy Stimson or pygmy banded python. And all of a sudden I hear the car moving, and I'm like, why are you driving the car? You can't. And my daughter's like, Dad, we're in the back seat. We're not.
Oh my
driving.
God.
I had to run back and hurry and stop the car before it rolled off the hill or something. So,
that's terrifying.
Terrible dad moment there, but yeah. So yeah, you could see how excited I was to find this python. But you know, they're very different. They have a different head structure. It's very short, you know, kind of a stubby head, compared to either a Stimson's or a spotted. They stay very small. They're almost the size of a pygmy python. Much smaller than either spotteds or Stimsons. They live in kind of an area where you don't see a lot of the other species. You know, not a ton of overlap, but there is some overlap. So I don't know.
Since you discovered them, can't you just name them? They're like Julanderensis or something.
I can't take credit. You know, I didn't discover them, and they were pretty well known. They were calling them pygmy Stimsons because they just thought they were Stimson's python that was, you know, stunted because it's a difficult area to live in or something like that. They were just smaller Stimson's pythons, but their pattern, you know, just their scalation, the structure, you know, head length and things like that are pretty significantly different. We included some of these metrics in the book, and actually Casey Lazick had taken a photo of one back in like the early 80s or something like that.
Oh, wow.
I think, as far as I could find, his was the first photo of the pygmy banded pythons that we could identify. And then I think Peter Krause had a picture of him. Peter Birch, who we wrote the complete children's python book with, Nick and I wrote with Peter Birch, and he proposed the name Krause-eye because Peter Krause had found them and had, I, noticed that they were different, but then I went back and Casey had also, I found some and thought they were something different. So, they could be Lazici or something. We kind of joked around. For me, I don't really like naming after people. Just
should be after the place.
Yeah, some kind of characteristic of the animal or the place they're from, or some kind of, I don't know, just that's, I prefer that kind of naming system.
So do I. Yeah, I think it's more respectful, instead of it just being like, some dude that showed up one time, and found it and now it's his animal,
Exactly.
it's
or named after some person that had nothing to do with it, but he funded the trip, or
sure.
Yeah, then you wind up getting things named all goofy sorts of things if you start doing it that way. But and I mean, we have plenty of ridiculous names out there, and maybe it's a little fun to do that or something. But down the road 100 years, are people going to go, what are they thinking? What was why is this funny to them? What a weird bunch of people. So
they're gonna think that no matter what 100 years from now. I was gonna say, like, do you think that if we had all the money and the resources to do it, would the best thing to do would just be to go through all these different areas and ranges and collect animals and take blood samples and run genetic testing and then see how far apart each animal is, and then once it hits a certain percentage, then that becomes the next species or subspecies or something like that? Like that, would that be the most ideal way of doing it?
I mean, that's kind of what they're doing with that too. And I think you need more than just one metric. I don't think you can just say, I guess, I mean, unless it's an obvious thing, then yeah. But I think they require more than just saying, oh, there's a genetic change here, whatever. I think you need metric or morphometrics, as well as genetics, as well as range or some kind of biogeographical barrier or something like that. And that's kind of the concept we used with the carpet pythons. And with the complete carpet python, I think my favorite contribution that I made that was actually novel, as far as I could tell, was lining up a genetic analysis that was done by, in a paper by Sehy and colleagues. They did a big, they took a lot of different localities of carpet pythons and looked at that, the genetic differences and structures within that. And I actually took their kind of groupings that they had from their analyses and overlaid it with the river drainage basins in Australia, and it almost matched up too perfectly. Like it really fit with that. And it makes a lot of sense because carpet pythons move with the rivers and creeks and stream beds. They're really highly associated with trees, and so where do you have trees? By water. And so the water drainage basins would definitely make sense. Like, so if a raindrop hits on the top of a peak and it either goes this way or that way, you're going to have a river down on this side or on this side, and they're separated by that kind of peak or whatever. Wow. So it makes sense that they would be either isolated within those river basin drainage basins. So that just kind of came to me as I was thinking about things and how do we separate these. And then in addition to that, along with that, another kind of fun thing that came out of that was, we kind of identified the Black Mountain Corridor area of this biogeographical barrier where you see speciation on either side of it. Right. So it just seemed like a barrier to gene flow. So they weren't crossing this to interbreed with different populations. So very similar populations were getting separated and kind of speciating away from each other on either side of this barrier. And so we thought, oh, that's interesting, and that's kind of where we are kind of thinking, there was genetic differences between carpets above and below, rather than like ones that look like jungles and ones that look like coastals. We didn't really see much of a genetic difference between those. And so that's kind of the reasoning why we said, okay, gelatins and everything north of there belongs to Variegata, and south of the Black Mountain Corridor, that's Sehy and other jungle-like or northern coastals are in there too. So we kind of lump those together. And then another biogeographical barrier further down kind of fit with the coastal carpets around what we're calling the southern coastal carpets around Brisbane, and that kind of a little bit further north of Brisbane, kind of there was a separation there that we could see kind of genetically, as well as a biogeographic barrier there. So that's kind of the structure we went with, I guess. And so mixing those different avenues kind of helps you maybe piece the puzzle together a little easier, where you have more lines of evidence. Okay, not only are they genetically distinct, they also have different river drainage basins, and also there's these biogeographic barriers separating the different populations, if that makes sense. So you don't just say they're genetically different, so we're going to call them different things. You say they're genetically different, they also have biogeographical barriers separating, and you also have, different other biotic factors that are contributing to that. So that's kind of the reasoning that we went with. Now, I guess we had some consideration of color and pattern, like going back to the example of that carpet python in the Iron Range, which is in far north Queensland. It looked just like a Darwin carpet, and a lot of those on the Cape York Peninsula, kind of above the Black Mountain corridor, did have that appearance of looking similar to a Papuan or a Darwin carpet python. And Darwin's and Papuan carpet pythons also look very similar to each other. And so kind of that, and then considering that they were connected, maybe 8,000 years ago, then we could kind of say, okay, these are fairly closely related. Genetic wise, they looked pretty closely related. Of course, the Darwins were a little further out there as compared with the Papuans and the northern Queensland animals. So that's kind of why the reasoning behind just lumping them all in variegata. So,
do we know how long the Papuans have been separated from the other carpets?
Yeah, I mean, it was the last ice age back in the Pleistocene, about 9,000 years ago, something like that.
Okay.
That's when the last land bridge occurred. Now, that's not to say some didn't float over on a log and there's some genetic mixing that way. But I mean, they've been separated for a little while, but in I guess geologic terms, that's not that long.
Yeah.
So, but
and did you say that there's Antaresia as well?
Yeah. There's spotted pythons in the south of New Guinea.
Are those being exported?
Yeah, I think Dan Mallory had some. I think he bred them even, maybe, or he at least brought some in from New Guinea, and they've called those, Antaresia papuensis, I believe. So they've named them their own species, which I think is goofy. They should be the same species that occurs in northern Queensland, which are the Cape York spotted pythons. Which they gave a subspecies designation to.
Okay, so the Cape Yorks are a subspecies of Maculosa?
Yeah, and they do have some differences in appearance, and I mean, it gets a little hazy, so I was trying to make because as you go further north, like some of those animals in New Guinea and some in the Torres Strait kind of have more of a granity look to them. And there's some down in the south, in normal Maculosa range that look similar to those. So I don't know. That's why it's difficult to go off phenotype, what they look like to base your characterization or your taxonomy on, because there is variability and their pattern and color a lot of times depend on what their habitat is. And so, I mean, if you always see them in one specific habitat, then that might be an argument for using different color and pattern differences. I know, with the green tree pythons, this was kind of another paradigm shift, as we always thought, okay, animals from southern New Guinea, like Maruki and those kind of localities, although Maruki is not necessarily a green tree locality, technically animals are imported into Maroki from, wherever they're found in the jungles, but Maroki doesn't necessarily have supporting jungle habitat for green tree pythons. But anyway, they were striped, right? They had that white stripe on their vertebrae along their vertebral surface. And then you had the ones in Australia had that stripe. And so people just assumed, okay, that's what they look like from this area. But then somebody like Daniel Natouche comes along and says, no, I've been in that area. I've seen, hundreds of animals that came from Merauke region or from Aru or whatever. And they don't all look like that. They have the same phenotypes as some animals from the northern population, from Missouri, from the different species, so who knows for sure? Maybe that's just kind of carried in the background, and based on where they end up is kind of what kind of comes forward in terms of pattern and color. But I think the environment and the landscape definitely play a pretty big role. And my hypothesis was, if you took a clutch of coastal carpets, northern coastal carpet pythons, and you put them in a rainforest setting, like in a pen out in the rainforest, and the ones that hatched out a little darker, more like a jungle carpet, probably blend in better with the dappled light of the jungle. And so they might hide better from predators, whereas the, maybe browner, tan looking things might stand out a little bit more in a green, setting. And so they're picked off first. And so you have a natural selection for the animals that look like a jungle carpet python. So that's why you see that phenotype in rainforests compared to grasslands and kind of more non-jungle areas. What's the word I'm looking for here? Just woodlands, the scrub forest, where a coastal carpet python that's kind of more tan or brown colored is going to blend in a lot better than a black and yellow snake, so that's why you see the phenotype of jungle carpet in the jungle, and you see the coastal carpet phenotype in the coastal plains or grasslands or whatever. So
what was the weather like when you found the jungle carpet pythons, or what was the area like? Is it like tropical rainforest? Is it like hot? Is it cool? I'm really curious about that. I absolutely love jungles. I have 2.3 of them, and yeah, I'm just crazy about them, and I can't wait to. I've got 4x2 by 2.5 inch or 2.5 foot tall enclosures coming. Could you imagine? And I'm just super excited to set that wall of enclosures up for them, and just go all out and make it, so I kind of want to try my best to recreate what they were in. Was it very humid? What was it like at night? Things like that.
Yeah. So this is only finding two. I can't necessarily say that I know exactly where, what they should look like or where they live. But the first one we found, the uglier one, I guess, was, it was kind of funny because it was right after I had said, oh, it's too cold and rainy, we're not going to find any snakes. And then like 2 minutes later, we found a jungle carpet crossing the road. Yeah. So it was about maybe high 60s, low 70s, somewhere in there. It was raining lightly, kind of a mist rain, but it was coldish, right? We'd been up in far north Queensland. And so I don't know about you, but for me, like I always thought, okay, rainforest, hot, sweaty, muggy, miserable. And obviously they are at some times of the year, but look, when I was writing the green tree book and when I was in green tree python territory, the temperature in the forest was like 70 degrees, pretty much constant, so if you went out of the forest into the sunlight in the, in kind of the areas that were cleared or didn't have trees, it got really hot really fast. Then it was up over, 90, 100 degrees or something. Also, the caveat being I was only over there in like October or November when I was there, so early spring. So it's probably a little milder than in the middle of the summer. Now, I just got back from a trip to the East Kimberley, and it was 110 during the day and like 93 at night. I'm trying to sleep in a tent and I'm miserable. Trying to sleep at 90 degrees is not very comfortable. So Obviously, the time of year you're there depends on the conditions you're going to encounter. When I was in South Australia, it was really cold. I was down in the 60s, 50s some nights. And so, we were a little chilly out looking for snakes and lizards at night. So, obviously the time of year you go there is going to influence what you're seeing and the conditions you're experiencing. So I can't say that I've lived in the rainforest or in Cairns, for a year. So I know exactly how it is, but looking at kind of the weather patterns and the temperature patterns, gives you an idea of, and so that's why we included all those weather graphs and
Sure.
temperature graphs in the book. But I guess my point is, if it depends on where you're at. If you're in the middle of the forest, then it's going to be a little like the trees kind of block out the sun, and it tends to be a little cooler, a little more dark, and that kind of thing. That's what rainforests are really good at, is blocking that sun and really capturing the light. That's why the trees grow so tall, and they outcompete each other. If you can't get that sunlight, you don't grow. And so you don't see a lot of seedlings growing up in the middle of the forest, because they're kept from the light to some extent. So, my ideas changed a lot when I was in the habitat. I always thought, you don't want to let your jungles get below 80 degrees. That's too cold for them. But then when I'm finding one actively moving on the road at 70 degrees in the rain, I'm thinking, okay, my idea of this was wrong. They don't need to be at 80 degrees. They can be at 70 just fine, and they're gonna be out hunting or out looking for food or out moving or whatever they're doing. Same with the second one. We were driving now. So the first one we found near a lake. So it was in kind of primary habitat, lots of big trees, rainforest, kind of leaf litter type substrate, I guess, and lots of climbing areas, branches, that kind of thing. So
it must have been really cool there then, with it being a body of water and everything. I mean, that drops the temperature considerably as well, right?
Yeah, right. And it increases the humidity and things like that. I never really thought humidity was critical, and I still don't think it's necessarily critical to breed carpet pythons or keep them successfully. You don't need to necessarily have 70-80% humidity or anything like that, but that's where they're from. I guess that's one of the things, is how to draw out what is important for keeping them happy and healthy, and what is just what they deal with. Like I said, in East Kimberley, it was 110 during the day, but you didn't see pythons out at 110. They waited until it was down to 80 or 85 or something to come out, or wait for the rain, and then they're going to come out, that kind of thing. So
yeah, they're probably in the middle of a log that's 74 degrees or something like that.
Exactly. So the reptiles find a way to kind of keep themselves in that range between maybe 70 and 80 degrees. And if they're gravid, maybe they bump it up to 85 or 90 or something. And if they're digesting food, they'll bump it up as well. There's reports of scrub pythons that bask on these epiphytic ferns that attach to the side of a giant tree, and these giant ferns grow out of the tree, or they're attached to the trunk of the tree way up 30 feet up in the canopy. And these scrub pythons climb up the trees and lay on top of these ferns and bask in the sunlight, high up in the trees. And they're going to do that when they're digesting a meal or something like that. So they're not down on the ground, immobile and vulnerable to predators necessarily. Not that there's that many predators in Australia. Once the big scrub gets that big, they're probably the top predator in their area. But just that idea of different temperatures for different jobs. So I would say, if you're designing what I've done with my enclosures is I'll put a hot spot on one end of the cage and kind of have a barrier, so the hot spot can stay 90, 95, somewhere on there, and then the cool side gets down 70, 80, something like that. That might be a little challenge where you're from, but for me, it's no problem.
I mean, well, my wife is one of these types that she wants to put the air down to 70 and then put on a hoodie and wrap herself in a blanket and get on the couch, you know, so, and which is fine. And I think that that's beneficial to the animals. And my whole thing was, I want this to be as consistent as possible. So I got a smart thermostat, you know, so that the air kind of goes to 78 at 5 a.m. So then the temperature in the house rises throughout the day. And, you know, the snake room I'm in here gets up to, you know, when it's warm outside, 81 degrees because all the fixtures and everything in here. So it's at that for maybe 3 or 4 hours. And then at 4 o'clock, it drops down to 76. And then it keeps dropping down until about midnight where it's at 70. So the whole house is kind of going through a natural fluctuation like you might see in nature. And that's what I want for the animals, is I want them to get, you know, a warm afternoon, a warm part of the day, and then have a cooling, you know, in the evening where it drops down. And I used to use deep heat projectors, you know, and now I've just switched over to actual basking bulbs. So that is, you know, gone at night, you know, so they're not getting this artificial heating throughout the entire night. And that's changed their behavior, which has been really fascinating to watch, where they actually appreciate their basking spot now. You know, I've noticed that first thing in the morning, they're getting on that. And then they might go and hide. And then at the end of the day, when the UV lights all turn off and it starts getting dark, but the basking bulb is still on, they'll go and get on that for maybe 10 or 15 minutes before it goes out for the night. So it's changing their behavior, which is really fascinating to watch, right? You're actually watching your animals do more, you know, do stuff. They're actually being more active.
Yeah, and that's a natural cycle. I mean, they don't have a constant temperature in nature. You know, it's always changing with the season, with the time of day. And so, you know, in northern Queensland, you'll see scrub pythons in the winter. They'll be out basking on these rocks. They'll move to these rocky areas where they can bask. Same with diamond pythons. You know, in the winter months or the cooler months, they'll move towards the cliffs where in the rocky escarpments, where they can still get a little bit of sun to kind of boost their temperature up when they need to, or they'll just kind of hang out in the cracks or the cliffs or the caves in the rocks. Man, I can't talk this morning, but they move seasonally to different habitats. So and then during the summer, when it gets a little warmer, they'll move into the woodlands. Spring, they'll kind of congregate for breeding, things like that. I think the scrubs congregate to breed in the winter, you know, when they're all basking on these rocks. They're also meeting up with the females and males and things like that. So, and, you know, but if you go to that same habitat a couple months later, there's not a scrub to be found, even though that's where you find all the scrubs during, you know, that period of time. And it's kind of a famous area where you can go and see, you know, 5, 10, 15 scrubs hanging out in the same area, you know. So they use different habitats at different times of year for different purposes. And, you know, and also, you know, why you don't see a diurnal python in, you know, East Kimberley in November or December, because it's just too hot. And so they're not coming out until it gets dark. But maybe in the winter, when it gets down, you know, almost close to freezing in some areas in the Kimberley, that was kind of a surprise to me. I thought, oh, no way it gets that cold there. But yeah, it can get pretty cold in certain areas. And, you know, they're going to be basking in the daytime because it doesn't get hot in the winter, you know, so they're having to reach that temperature, that physiological need for that temperature. So they're going to change their behavior accordingly. So, you know, when it's hot, they're nocturnal. When it rains, they'll come out because, you know, it cools down a little bit, gives them moisture, that kind of thing. So, I was listening to, I think it was Snake Talk with that podcast, and they were talking about, milk snakes and king snakes, and you know, you see very seasonal movements, and usually associated with rain or, you know, some kind of weather event where, you know, if it rains, you're going to probably find more milk snakes in West Texas than if it's not raining, that kind of thing, you know. So they're going to move it when the conditions are right for them to move. And they're not going to move. They're going to go deep in underground if the conditions are too severe for them to be out in. So that's the beauty of reptiles, right? Is they can adapt, and they can sit for a long time in a single spot. There was a study that Gavin Bedford did with Darwin carpet pythons in the botanical gardens in Darwin, and he found one animal that he was radio tracking basically stayed in the same tree for almost a year.
That's insane.
Yeah. So either food was coming to him, or mates or whatever, or her, I can't remember if it was a male or a female, but stayed in the same tree for almost a year. That's not a lot of movement. Whereas, you know, other ones that he tracked moved great distances. So, you know, it just depends.
Wow. Well, getting back to the genetic differences and everything, why are Brettles pythons not carpet pythons?
No, they're carpet pythons. They're not Spilota carpet pythons, but they're part of the carpet python complex for sure. And they're you know, in the same genus, Morelia. Now, I guess the rough-scaled pythons are also in Morelia, as are green tree pythons. So I guess not all of them are carpets necessarily, but and maybe that argues the fact that maybe chondros shouldn't be in Morelia. Maybe they should be back in chondropython, but like we call them chondros. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, Brettles fit within the carpet python complex, and are very similar in structure. Genetically, they're definitely distinct, and they're isolated out in the center of Australia, but they probably radiated from a common ancestor with a lot of the carpets. Brettles actually showed up as closer, at least in this one paper by Sehy that did the big genetic analysis on all the different carpets. Brettles were closer to diamonds than coastals were. So
that's wild.
Yeah, in this region that they looked at of the DNA, you know, sequence. So that just they're definitely classified, you know, closely related to carpet pythons, and I think they fit. You know, they call them Brettles carpets or Centralian carpet pythons.
So they are carpets. They're just not Spilota.
Yeah. Same with the southwestern carpets. They're imbricata, Morelia imbricata, but they're not a Spilota carpet, but they're a carpet python.
Okay. But then rough scales, they're not included, even though they are Morelia.
Yeah, they're not included in the carpet python complex, even though they're, you know, somewhat closely related. And we did include those in the complete carpet python book, just because they, you know, where else are you going to put them? Same with the Owen Pelly python. We fit those in the complete carpet as well, or the more complete carpet. Put Owen Pellies in there too. The Carinata, the rough scale pythons, were in both the complete carpet and the more complete carpet, but we threw in Owen Pellies in the second because we thought, who's going to write a book just on Owen Pellies? And then Gavin Bedford wrote a book just on Owen Pellies, which is a great book. I was able to hang out with Gavin in Australia and get to pick his brain. He's such a wealth of information, but just a really nice guy too. But yeah, I got to get a copy from him. So
that's awesome. Nice. My son comes out to my car one day. He was watching a show that Gavin was on. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the guy's name. Younger guy. He's kind of a crocodile hunter, you know, for my kids.
Is it Jack somebody?
Jack Randall, is that his name?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And my son comes out. Yeah. My son comes out and I just pulled in the driveway from work and he goes, "Can we get an Owen Pelly python?"
Yeah. If only.
Yeah. I'm like, I don't know, buddy. Maybe one day.
Yeah. Gavin invited us over to his house and we got to go see his Owen Pellies. One of his females was sitting on eggs. You know, we got to handle a newly hatched one as well as a big, you know, old 15-footer or whatever. It was pretty awesome. They're pretty amazing snakes. I was really hoping to see one in the wild, and disappointed that we didn't find one, but that's one of the more difficult species to find.
Mm.
And we also had some kind of obstacles in the way with that, but yeah, we gave our best looking for them.
What were the obstacles?
Well, one area we were planning on going to, they had put in a gate so you couldn't go in after dark to that area. And then they'd closed the trails that led to that area. So, and that's where the guys had seen one several years back. Eric and Owen and Keith and Rob had all seen a Owen Pelly out in that specific spot. And then, so we couldn't go there. And then another area we were going to go look for him in, which we actually did end up searching, but it had burned, like the area across the street from it had burned the day that we were supposed to go there and go search that area.
Wow.
And then also a ranger grabbed us before we headed out and said, "Oh, keep off the escarpment. Just stay on the road. You can be out after night, but you can't walk on the escarpment." So we're like, dang it. That's
wow.
an easier way to find them, I guess, if you're climbing where they're at. But we spent lots of hours walking around those trails, but did not see one, unfortunately.
Wow.
Did see some other cool stuff. We did find, I was able to find my first rough knobtail in the wild. We found a Nephrurus Sehy, the northern rough knobtail gecko, or whatever they call it, common name. I for some reason with the knobtails, I just know the scientific names. I don't have a good memory of their common names, but
do you keep a lot of knobtails?
I've got a few species. Yeah, I like them a lot. They're really cool lizard. I think my favorite gecko is probably a Centralian knobtail, the Nephrurus amiae. But It was really a big thrill to find a Sehy in the wild. I'm hoping to find an amiae in the spring here. We're going to Central Australia, so
hell yeah. Nice. Best of luck to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I've looked for those before, but that was my first trip. We did a trip to Cairns and Iron Range, and then we went into the center of Australia and into Alice Springs area. And then it was the wettest year on record, so it pretty much rained on us the whole time, which was not the best for herping, but it did allow us to see waterfalls coming off of Uluru or Ayers Rock and see some really cool cloud cover at Catajuda or the Olgas. Really cool spot. So can't wait to get back there and have a go at it again.
Hell yeah. How do you keep your geckos? Like what size enclosure and what kind of hot spot do they need? And then what do you like, what's their diet mostly?
Yeah. The knobtails, they like dubia roaches for the most part. At least the Centralian, the rough skin species really tend to go after those dubias. But I feed dubias, crickets, mealworms occasionally. They don't really go for the mealworms. I don't think they move enough. They're really kind of movement oriented predators, and so if they're not moving very much, but I'll get them to eat them every once in a while. The cage size depends on kind of the size of the animal, but I've got them from anywhere from maybe a foot and a half to 3 feet of whatever. I'm really bad at cage sizes. Everybody says, 20 gallon or 30. I have no clue what, I just kind of go by inches for the most part, but about 3 foot cage for my Asper female, they're just depending on the species, but usually in a rack type setup, although I have been working on some proper cages so I can see them better. They're fun to watch. And so, having them in a rack kind of defeats that purpose. So I think I, like a lot of people, fell into the I guess Brian Barczyk, I call it the Brian Barczyk factor of, he shows off his collection and all his breeding, racks. He's just got rows and rows and rows of racks. And that kind of was like, oh, that's the gold standard. That's what the great breeders do. And then as you get into it, you realize, maybe I want to give my animals a little more than that. I don't want to just stuck in a drawer. And I understand, like, for commercial breeding purposes, if you're supplying PetSmart with a certain species or something, you're not going to be able to give them all, the size they necessarily would appreciate. But, so that's kind of, I've trying to shift from using racks over to using cages, larger cages for the animals. So I guess that's kind of a bit of an aside, but yeah.
Well, no, I mean, it's something, I like talking about. I raise up a lot of my animals in racks and then moving them into enclosures. It's pretty wild seeing the change in their behavior. Just as far as being able to handle them, they're much less defensive because they've been habituated to my presence in the room. I've noticed that I recently moved my Papuan carpet into a 4x2x2, and he had like 3 bowel movements within 2 or 3 days.
Yeah,
it was wild.
Yeah.
So it must have just been, I don't know if it was, it wasn't diarrhea either. Like it was just normal bowel movements. And I'm like, wow. So it must have been the lack of movement in this tub that as soon as he went into the 4x2x2, he's perched up. And then at night he'd cruise and cruise and cruise. And it was just like everything came out. That was a weird observation that I did not plan on.
I like it. Like writing the green tree python book really alerted me to that concept of like, so, you see a lot of green trees in captivity and they just sit on a perch and they don't move. And they a lot of times they'll hang their tail because they're full of feces and, they can't really have bowel movement because they're overfed and they're under, they have a smaller enclosure. Whereas the wild specimens are very small. They're very thin. They move up and down a tree pretty much every day, so they're crawling 30 feet up a tree. Jeez. And, they're that movement definitely stimulates, that like you saw with your Papuan, it's going to stimulate the natural flow of their digestive tract kind of thing. And so, if we're not giving them, that motivation to move, which is in captivity, it's food. And then the other thing I found is that they don't eat all that much in the wild. Like
sure.
There's just not that many prey items available, especially rodents in the rainforest, except for certain times of year. So they're moving and setting up shop and hunting pretty much every day, but they're not catching food every day. But every time we see them perched up and like, hanging their head down, they're like, oh, he's hungry, I got to feed him. That's, and that's the way we interact with our reptiles in captivity. So, I guess that's what we like to see. But at the same time, we're saying, oh, you can keep them in a 2x2x2 cube and they're just fine, and, I guess to some extent they can do fine in there and you can breed them. But I really think that's doing them a disservice, to keep them too fat, too hot, too sedentary, too wet, whatever. So they've kind of been a challenge in that regard. And I think too, some of the earlier books, they would say, you have to wait until your female is 1,000 grams to breed, a green tree python. In the wild, green tree pythons rarely exceed 1,000 grams. Like that's a giant old specimen would maybe reach 1,000 grams. And it's like maybe less than a tenth of the population for sure. Maybe 1% of the population reaches 1,000 grams. So, why would we want to do something so unnatural to our green tree pythons? Why would we want to get them to 1,000 grams? They might lay 30 eggs, but half of them are slugs and they die after 5 years. It's like just kind of a weird concept. And, I don't fault them. We didn't have that much information on them. But when I started looking into some of the scientific literature and some of the papers that were being published, observing them in the wild, I'm like, there's a huge disconnect between what they're doing in the wild and how we're keeping them in captivity. So that was the main reason I wanted to write that book, is to be like, okay, let's look at what they do in the wild. And I got criticized for, it's too much of a natural history book or whatever. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing about reptiles, is what they do in nature and how they are in nature. I don't care about them necessarily in a box. Like I like to keep because it reminds me of what I saw in nature, or, it gets me kind of closer to things that maybe I couldn't go see in nature yet or whatever. But the more I get out and herp, the less I want to keep animals in a box. The more I want to expand their enclosures and give them more room and more space. And
Keep them in a bigger box.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's always going to be a box. When people say, "Oh, I keep it in a arboreal cage," it's 3 feet tall, and you're like, "Have you ever seen a 3 foot tall tree and called it a tree?" Yeah, trees are 30 feet tall. If you have an arboreal cage, I want to see you have a 30-foot tall cage. But that's the limitation we have in captivity. And again, it goes back to kind of that thought of, we need to find out what's important for them to do well and to be happy and to thrive, and provide that, rather than, okay, do they really need a 30-foot tall tree to accomplish what they need to accomplish? Would they appreciate it? I don't even know if they'd appreciate it, if they'd use it, if you had a 30-foot tall enclosure and you gave them a tree all the way up and down, if they'd actually climb up and down the tree, or if they just sit at the base of the tree. Who knows? It's like,
yeah,
things. But the important thing is the maybe more important would be the temperature or the whatever. I guess we can look at something like the Reptilandia in Texas, the new reptile zoo out there that
incredible, yeah.
Ari and Ryu are building and completing or whatever. That looks fantastic. I'm really excited to go visit that place and see kind of how the reptiles behave, because you see reptiles in zoos, and a lot of times I'm a little disappointed. You see these half dead or like way fat or just undercooked. They don't have the temperatures they need, especially like monitor lizards, to actually do what monitor lizards do. So they're just kind of lump on a rock, well, way too fat or something. So those kind of things are very that all factors into this thing, So I don't know. I guess, what am I trying to say here?
I mean, having been out in the wild and observing these animals, and having that be one of your primary passions, it seems like in with herps and reptiles and everything, how has that impacted the way you keep? Are you moving more and more in that direction, where you want to observe them and their behavior and how they interact with their environment? Or I mean, for me personally, I'm not keeping animals to breed them, to sell and things like that. I have breeding plans, but my primary thing that I want to do is observe the animals. Like that's what I really get enjoyment out of, is observing them. And if they're in a drawer, I can't observe them. And that's me though, right? Yeah. Like, I'm not saying that that's what everybody else needs to do. That's how I'm keeping my snakes, because that's my goal. I don't have a bottom line or a dollar amount that I need to make off of my animals at the end of the year.
Right.
My primary focus is enjoying them and watching them and seeing how they behave throughout the year. Are you going more in that direction now that I mean, it seems like that's one of your all-time favorite things, right? Is going out and seeing the animals in the wild, right?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a natural progression. We get excited, and when you start out keeping, you just want to keep everything that you think is cool, and so you're just all over the board. Just oh, that's cool. I'm going to get that. I'm going to get that, and then you kind of narrow it down into what you really are interested in. Sometimes you'll get stuff, and it's like, this doesn't really mix well, or it's not what I thought it would be, or every time I pick it up, it musks me, or, squeezes all over me or something. Or
don't talk about my Timor pythons
exactly.
like
that. And so you're like, I really didn't think that was what they were going to be, and I don't appreciate that, so I'm going to move them on to maybe somebody who appreciates that. The big bitey schweezy things, those can go to Owen McIntyre. So when we kind of focus in on what we really like, and that's kind of what I did with there's so many cool reptiles, and I would love to keep just everything under the sun, because I love tortoises, I love different colubrids and rattlesnakes and all sorts of stuff, but right now my room is kind of centered around tropical, semi-tropical, whatever pythons. So that's what I kind of have the majority of. Now I also have some lizards that maybe come from the same habitat and that kind of thing, but it's focused around those Australian animals. And I've tried to keep other stuff. I've got a pair of California king snakes and I've worked with hognose snakes and stuff during this time, and some other things that they didn't really fit very well in the room. And so
Yeah.
I had to, I still have the king snakes. It's not a very long project, but the others have kind of gone by the wayside, or I've gotten rid of them down the road, back in the day or whatever. So I'm just focused in on what I truly want to keep, but I'm replacing that. Instead of keeping them in captivity, now the next stage, I think, in my development is moving out and seeing them in the field. And, obviously it's a little more expensive to go out and spend a week looking and, spending your time and effort and renting a car and having a place to stay and all those kind of things gets a little pricey. And so now that I'm a little older and I have a little more extra income that I can use, then it becomes easier. So I think that progression maybe comes with age as well. But I just really appreciate seeing them in the wild and experiencing there. And that almost feels that need to keep them in a cage or keep them in a box, and almost keeps me from wanting to keep them in a cage or a box, because then I see what they do in the wild and I'm like, oh my goodness. Like this last trip to East Kimberly, I found a Kimberly rock monitor and watched it climb, all over the rocks. And I mean, in the time that I interacted with that animal, it moved probably 80 feet, and I'm like, there's no way to provide that for an animal to be able to watch it move and climb and go up this cliff, 20 feet up, and then move over on the cliff face and you walk on the rock like Spider-Man kind of thing. So I'm like, I would love to be able to see them every day and to watch them and things like you said, I think a lot of things I just want to watch and learn from and interact with that way. So that's what I'm kind of moving towards. But I did get stuck in that, I can keep so many things in a rack and I can keep a lot more stuff. And now I'm thinking, okay, numbers is not that important. I want to keep, quality, maybe have a fewer things. Now that said too, I also believe that it's important to kind of champion a project. And so the project I've kind of chosen and what I have the most of are the wheat belt or Western Stimson's pythons. I've also got a broom locality of Western Stimson's pythons. And so that's a project that's very important to me. And so I've got, multiple animals and I don't breed most of them every year, but I've got a fair diversity of different phenotypes and sizes and whatever. But, which makes it a little difficult to keep those all in, 4-foot cages. I'd run out of room quick. So I have to kind of compromise with some things, I guess. If I want to keep that project alive and diverse as I can, then I have to, have a few more animals in maybe smaller cages than I'd like. But at the same time, I'm trying to give the animals I do keep larger space and trying to improve that as I go, and kind of letting some projects go and moving them on or and just focusing on specific projects that do well here, that I've done very well with those Western stems. And I don't know that anybody's produced more of them in the US than I have, at least at this point. And then
that's awesome.
They're kind of hard to find. So I was fortunate to get the project pretty early. So that's been a lot of fun. But
damn, I might have to get a pair of those from you.
They're fun. I really like them.
I've fallen in love with spotteds. I got a striped spotted from Ryan, a female, and I totally fell in love with it. And I was like, next season, I want a pair so I can have a trio. So now I've got a pair waiting for me as soon as the temperatures warm up a little bit, and they're still getting started too. But that's they're such cool little animals, and they've got so much personality. I made this stupid TikTok view and it got over 2 million views. So I think I own the most popular spotted python in America.
Awesome. Yeah, I like the Antaresia are just one of my favorite groups, just because they're so small, but they're also pythons. They have all that python personality in a small form. Now you're not going to have to go to the hospital because you got bit by your spotted python, but if you have keeper ticks, that's that's an option. You might wind up with some very deep scars and wounds because of your tick, but that's not going to happen with a spotted python or Stimson's python. Yeah. So
yeah, I think I'm going to keep them in, or I am going to keep them in 3 foot by 2 foot by 1.5 foot tall enclosures.
Yeah.
So I can do, a stack of those and, keep my trio there. Then it's like, where else could I fit another stack and get into more Antaresia, and especially, so the spotteds come more from more tropical, humid environment, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the, so that's how I'm going to build their enclosure out. Now, if you were to do one for the stems, what kind of enclosure would you be doing for them? More arid? Do people keep them on like a sand substrate, or would it, is that not a good idea if you're trying to do that more naturalistic look? Like how would you do it?
Yeah. So, I actually went and found a wheat belt Stimson's python. Well, my friend located it, but we were out looking in the environment where they're found, and out in Western Australia. Now it does get pretty cold. This is in kind of southern Western Australia. The wheat belt, as its name implies, is an area of just intense wheat farming. So there's wheat fields as far as the eye can see, except for in areas where there's giant rock outcrops that they can't plow and grow wheat on. So that's kind of the last islands of where these snakes persist. And so we found one of these outcrops and just walked along on the rock. So it's basically just a big rocky outcrop. So, you could keep them on a rocky, a rock layer, kind of a whatever tiles or whatever, kind of replicates a rocky surface. And then we found it under a big boulder. Like it was underneath there, just under a boulder that was sitting rock on rock kind of thing. This was in the spring. So, that's maybe just coming out. I don't know if they hang out under rocks like that the whole year round, but I know that there was some studies done in Stimson's pythons in Central Australia, and they found that they overwintered under rocks that were, so
maybe a good opportunity for some DIY backgrounds, doing some kind of sandstone look and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So
is it pretty red there? Like kind of like the red stones and things like that?
Yeah, there was some red rock, but I'm trying to think. I guess I'm thinking of the lichens that were growing on the rocks. They were really there were some blue lichens and yellow lichens and stuff that were growing on the rocks, where at least where I photographed this animal, it was a cool background to look at. But yeah, I'll have to send you a picture of the what the environment looked like. But yeah, they do kind of blend in with their environment. So the rocks the base color was kind of that reddish brick red color. So they blend in nicely, I think. But yeah, so I think we found Stimson's pythons in the Pilbara, which is a rocky desert, and they were similar looking and had kind of similar habitat where they were in rocky substrates and things like that. So I don't know. I keep all mine on wood shavings, but it's not very appealing to look at necessarily. Sure. But it's easy to clean and change and things like that. But I think, a rocky background would be great. And that's kind of what I'm moving towards is, doing some of those fake rock backgrounds. I did a nice big cage for the diamond pythons. So I have a bunch of branches and some fake rock and stuff like that. Some shells, and some little caves they can hide under and stuff. So that's kind of that's what I'm moving towards with those. Now, sometimes that gets a little tricky to maintain, it's a little more effort to clean, and you got to get in there with a toothbrush and scrub the rock and stuff like that. But I think it's worth it for the visual appeal of the enclosure.
I'm going to have to hit you up for a list of what you're using for those backgrounds. I have like the Pink Panther foam, and I keep thinking about stacking it and chipping it away and making it look cool. But then I'm like, what do I what do I fill in the gaps with? What do I seal it with? What do I paint it with? You know, all that. And I end up just not doing it because I get kind of overwhelmed with the whole project, you know?
Right. Yeah. It can be a little tricky. And I've had definitely some misfires. I had some rock work that I did that I used the white, kind of pebbly foam that like you get your shipping containers or whatever that foam. And so like, that's a little more, it's not as rigid as the pink stuff or the green stuff or whatever. And so like if something hits it, it's going to make a hole. And I was using tile grout, which is pretty rigid. And so if it got hit and it was kind of a thinner layer, it would break and crack and stuff. So that I learned the hard way, like use the more rigid, expensive foam, which is the bottom line is cost a lot more, but it is easier to shape. And that's kind of what I do is I stack stuff together and I'll use the great stuff, the yellow spray foam.
Sure.
And so I'll kind of stick the pieces together with that and fill in the gaps with that and then kind of shape it after it dries and then cover it with, I've started using that hydraulic cement that they use to patch and it's like waterproof but it's a little trickier to work with than
it sets so fast.
Yeah,
right?
It does. Yeah. So you got to work with small quantities and do it quick, but I've found that works pretty well. And then I just use water-based paint that's safe, like an interior paint or spray paint or something. So
I thought about kind of molding something and shaping it out of foam and then using tight bond, because I used to do dart frog enclosures, and doing like a layer of just gob on the tight bond, and then take the Exoterra, like red sand, whatever sand you want, and just dust it on there and let it dry, and then do another layer of tight bond and keep doing that until you have this layered up, basically sandstone, kind of like if you were, whatever, caution painting a sidewalk, right? You'd have to throw down some sand and layer the paint on. I wonder if that would work, or I don't know. I might have to try it out, but I know it would be waterproof because I know the Type Bond, I think it's the Type Bond 3 is incredible for the dart frog enclosures. So, and then it would take the painting out of it, and so I don't know. I might give that a shot, especially, trying to do like sort of a red stone, background. It might work out.
Yeah.
But, that's something I haven't gotten into yet, the DIY backgrounds, because, I know it's going to be an abyss that I'll fall into.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it does take, I'm kind of an artist, and so I if I do a bad job or it doesn't look right, then I kind of get frustrated with myself. So, and then you've got an enclosure that took you, 20 hours to do. And then you're like, oh, this sucks. I don't like it. So that's kind of the downside of it. But, I don't know. I guess there's other options. There's some, but they're a little more expensive, like some of the, pre-made, fake rocks and things, the rock backgrounds and, that you can buy from like Ultimate Rocks or whatever the companies are. So,
yeah, I can't afford that.
yeah, exactly. Me too. That's why I've always done the DIY stuff. But I don't know. I enjoy it. I think it's fun, but it is time consuming and it's hard to find a time to. And then you got to do different steps. You got to let the grate foam expand and dry, and then you got to carve it, and then you got to, and it's kind of messy too. Carving foam gets just little pieces of foam everywhere, so that can be a challenge too.
You're testing your wife's patience at that point.
Exactly.
Trying to see how far you can take it.
Yeah. Luckily, the reptile room's in the detached garage, and so I have my own little space out there.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's all. That's what I need at some point. I got to get my own separate building. So, do you think that everybody should breed reptiles, or do you think that there should be more of a push towards people just being content with keeping snakes, or do you think that there's valuable lessons you can learn in breeding snakes that make you a better keeper?
I do think it's an enjoyable thing. I mean, I really like seeing baby carpets hatch out, and being able to, I definitely think if somebody's going to get a reptile, they should get a, well-established juvenile that's that they can raise up and it gets used to the conditions in their area. I don't know. A lot of times I found when I get adult animals or larger, they have their own, they kind of come with a set of problems. They're either
Mhm.
used to, Florida weather, and now they're coming to Utah and they're like, I don't like it here. I'm not going to thrive here or something. So, I do think that things do a little better once you raise them up in your environment, to some extent. But, I I do think that maybe we overproduce a little bit, especially trendy things, and that kind of leads to this roller coaster cycle of, you know, oh, they're everywhere, they're worthless. People kind of put dollar amounts to them, and so that that when everybody's producing them, then the value goes down, and then everybody gets rid of them because they're not worth enough money, and so then nobody has them. They're very hard to
Yeah.
find, and then people have a resurgence of interest in them, and then this is all occurring over a decade or so, or more, and then all of a sudden everybody wants them again, so people start breeding them, and then they get overproduced again, and then people get sick of them, and I don't know, it's kind of a weird cycle. Now the ball pythons fix that by having endless combinations and morphs and different things that they can do with their ball pythons. But I think we're seeing like crested geckos didn't have that diversity. And so now all of a sudden they're everywhere and people have what they want and people are overproducing them. And so now nobody, they're kind of in that trough of the roller coaster, and people, they're harder to sell, and people aren't wanting to buy that many of them and things like that. So just depends on when you hit the cycle and when you're in there. But I think definitely if they're hard to find or people are interested in them, there's no harm in producing them. It's just you need to know when to pull back, when to say, okay, I'm not going to breed my animals this year because there's already enough of them. They're morph market's full or whatever. You kind of look at how fast things are moving on morph market, and also say, hey, am I okay to hold on to these? I think a lot of people get into it without considering, I might have to keep the offspring for 3 or 4 years before I can move them all. Do you have the space to keep, and are you going to able to, keep expanding and getting larger and larger cages for each animal that you haven't sold within the first couple of years because they're outgrowing their juvenile tub or whatever. And I think that's the responsible part of it, because then when people can't do that, then they panic and they dump it. They get rid of it for cheap, and then that makes it kind of that perception that, oh, this is a dead project. And then people get that in their mind, oh, it's dead. Then nobody wants to touch it. And so it's kind of this thing. I really wish there was no value associated. It's almost like if we could go back to the good old days when you just traded reptiles, like, trading cards kind of thing. There wasn't this monetary aspect of it. And I think to some extent, the reptile trade is similar to a pyramid scheme. You're trying to talk people into getting their friends to buy the offspring, and if you produce this much, you can make this much money, and then if you get your friends to breed them, then all of a sudden you've got your competition in there. And so it's a weird mix. I don't know, herpetoculture, it can be kind of a strange thing once you throw the money in there. But I think if you work with stuff that's maybe less appreciated, or not everybody's breeding. I found that with the Antaresia. I really enjoy the Antaresia, but they're not the most popular snakes out there, and there's not a huge demand, and people aren't clawing down my door to buy them. But I sell them just fine. I do pretty well, and I have more of a problem of not advertising and not letting people know what I have for available. That's my problem. But so I don't know. I think, just kind of keep your finger on the pulse of it. Don't do anything for money. I think do things which you enjoy and what you get excited about and what you are going to stay passionate about, regardless of if you sell them all or if you sell none of them. Not to say that, selling it, your offspring is a bad thing. And it's, that's paid for a lot of my Australia trips, is the reptile money that I've, made from breeding and selling animals. And, if I can, I guess that's one thing I said. I didn't ever want to go full-time breeder, because I don't want my family's, food to depend on how many snakes I sell, because I see a lot of big breeders kind of making some shady decisions because of that. They need to make money, so they're going to do this or that to make ends meet. And I don't necessarily agree with that. So I said, I'm not going to have my family, dependent on my reptile sales. I'm going to have a normal job with regular insurance, that kind of thing. So
you think that it should be you shouldn't make any decisions based off of how much money you're going to make off of it if you're breeding an animal, if you're just a hobbyist, right?
Yeah. You're just a hobbyist.
It should be passion. It should be, I mean, like I've got my Argentine boas and I want to breed them because I think that they're like the coolest boa.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, they're one of those snakes that get a bad rap. I plan on keeping a ton of diamond pythons, but that's because I can do it outside.
Yeah.
So I think that that's like super cool that I can do that, so I've got plans of kind of keeping them in big 8 foot by 8 foot by 6 or 7 foot tall enclosures outside, maybe a trio in each cage. And I've got bottle brushes, cause they're Australian, and I'm going to plant that out. And I am so excited about that. Right. But I'm not thinking like, I'm going to be a millionaire based on this project. Like that's not a part of it.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Eric Burke about this, and I told him, I said, like, it's going to take me a while to get all those animals, right? Like getting a couple trios of diamond pythons is a ton of money,
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm taking my time with it. I'm not in a hurry.
Right. And I think too, like we see all the time that usually success follows the passion rather than the other way around. If you get into an animal just to make money, you're probably going to lose money. That's the sad truth of it. And what we see over and over again is if people like, not to say that you can't make money, breeding what everybody's interested in, but you really have to be kind of on the cutting edge to really do it right. And especially if you're working with something that's very trendy or flash in the pan, like a ball python morph, one day it's worth 30,000. The next year it's worth 300. You got to kind of be on top of things if you're going to play that game. But if you just love a species and I think, last name's Payne. What's his first name? Gosh, I'm terrible with names, but anyway, Frank Payne, he's shown like he's just kind of got a few projects that are underappreciated, and his passion and his excitement for them and the animals that he produces kind of drive the market for him, Yeah. And then he loves the animals because he kept them because of the passion, not because of the dollar signs, but the dollar signs come down the road, and he has no problem selling his offspring. I see people specializing that, Nick's a good example. Like he likes carpet pythons. He keeps a pretty big variety of things, but carpet pythons are kind of what he's known for. And so people come to him when they think about Brettle's carpet pythons, that kind of thing. So, we just, if you follow what you're really interested in, you usually don't lose that excitement or passion. And if you do, then it's probably time to move it on to somebody who is excited and passionate about it. And, if I could give away all my snakes and it wouldn't really hurt me that much, you know what I mean? Like I could just, hey, you want a snake? Here you go. And it wouldn't, I'd still be able to feed my family, and I'd still have that freedom. And then I'd be able to watch. And I've done that a few times where I've just given things to people if they're passionate about it and they can't afford it or something. Here you go, take it. Like
that's awesome.
Why not get them excited about what you're excited about? That's part of the fun of this. And if it's all about money and you're gonna pass on somebody because they don't have enough or something, maybe that you have to do that with certain projects, but at the same time, maybe have something that you can help foster that in somebody else. I know if I was a kid and somebody handed me a Centralian python and said, here you go, kid, and I'd be over the moon. I'd be doing everything I could to give that thing the best enclosure and life I could. So.
Yeah, I mean that's I have Timor pythons. I have a reverse trio, and you have to be passionate about those animals to want to keep them because it's every time you take them out, it's you're getting must on, and it can be kind of gross, but they're such a cool there's animals that I know I can take out and I can hold and I could go sit on the couch with them, and that's super cool. And then there's other animals that they are just not that. I'm
Yeah.
not taking my Timor anywhere near my couch, you know?
Well, and you have to know the animal and know what to like. I wouldn't expect to sit on the couch with my fish either. It's a fish, you watch it and you enjoy it that way. And I think that's part of it. When you're a kid, you have to grab everything and touch everything and hold everything. As the older I get, like looking at that Kimberly rock monitor crawling on the rocks in East Kimberly, I thought I could reach out and grab this thing. It's not that afraid of me. I'm really close to it. I was filming it with my iPhone, like a few inches away.
Wow.
And I'm like, I could catch this thing, but what's the point? I want to watch it do what it does naturally, not what it does when it's under duress because somebody just grabbed it, and then I could get some close up pictures or whatever, but then it's just going to take off and hide as soon as I let it go. So I'd rather spend, 5 minutes watching it do its thing rather than try to grab it and hold it and get a wanker photo of it, that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I think that just maybe comes with age and experience, or I will say that I have caught a lot of stuff to get those wanker shots,
Sure.
I do have those photos of myself holding things. So it's not that I'm opposed to it or don't think you should do it. I'm just not that interested in it. I'd rather just sit back and watch the animal do its thing. So, and like you said, if you appreciate your Timor for what it is and not what it's not, then you're going to love it and be passionate about it, regardless of if it squeezes when you pick it up or
Yeah. Yeah. That's like, I've taught my son that he needs to just appreciate the black racers in Florida without grabbing them.
Yeah.
Because, you grab them and they rip on you like a Rottweiler. Yeah. It's bizarre how hard they can bite, and they thrash their head around. And yeah, he did that one time. He grabbed one time and it grabbed him on the forearm and yanked around a little bit. And I think that was the last time. Now he just enjoys looking at him.
Yeah.
Ring necks he'll go pick up, but it's a different story. Talking about the evolution before, it makes me wonder what the Burmese python is going to be 10,000 years from now in Florida.
Right. Yeah. Is it to the point where it could be a different species? They're a little more cold tolerant. They're a little more, I don't know. I'm sure there's differences occurring. So here's an interesting example in mice with some mice. So I'm a research professor. I do studies with, viruses, right? And so we would infect mice with viruses and then treat them with different things that were supposed to have antiviral qualities. So we're trying to discover new antivirals. So we'll treat with these compounds that have shown activity in cell culture. So we got some mice and we were infecting with influenza. And some mice would get influenza and they would, be sick and show all the disease phenotype we needed. And then we could treat them and show that the drug makes it better or whatever. And some mice wouldn't get sick at all. We're like, what is going on? It's the same strain, the same company. Well, we found out we were getting mice from two different facilities. And the mice coming from one facility would be susceptible to the virus, and the mice coming from the other facility would not.
Whoa.
And they were the same mouse strain, the same, inbred strain. But what they'd done is they'd split that colony and moved one group to this this facility and one group to this facility. And they actually did a study where they compared the same strain of mouse, inbred strain, to each other in different facilities, and there was like 20,000 differences in their genetic.
Whoa.
So there was a huge range, a huge amount of change, and there's genetic drift and all these different things. And so moving something from Myanmar over, or wherever they were found, the Burmese pythons, over to Florida and having them be established in the wilds of Florida for the last 40, 50 years. I imagine there's plenty of changes that are occurring on a genetic level, on a physiological level, on all sorts of levels they're also biogeographically separated. They're not mixing their genetics, and so when does it become a new species? When is it a different, Floridensis subspecies or something? Who knows? It's
That's
kind of
so
an
cool.
interesting thing to think about, right? I
Yeah.
guess that same concept that Ben Morrill would talk, once you take it out of the wild, it stops being part of that species because you've moved it out of that species trajectory. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that
Yeah,
would,
I mean, we've got it all. We've got the chameleons, we've got the
yeah,
anoles, we've got the gammas, we've got everything here.
yeah, yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah, I think I did a trip out to Florida. I did see some cool natives, but I also saw a bunch of non-natives that were,
Hmm.
almost as fun to find in some ways. Yeah, some of those agamas are pretty cool.
Yeah, there was a paper that came out, or an article rather, that they're working on a scientific study on West Nile virus
Uh-huh.
and how the agamas are going to cause more West Nile in people because they are inhabiting the space that the brown anoles would normally inhabit. The agamas are spreading. They're becoming they're populating so many more areas, and they're going further north. I mean, I have friends all the way up in Sarasota that see them, and so they're thinking that because these guys like hide in rock crevices and everything at night when they sleep, that the mosquitoes won't get to them the way that they get to the anoles. So if the mosquito is not feeding on the anole, then it's going to be feeding on a person instead, and it's going to be or on birds rather, and then and spreading West Nile. I don't know. I'm
Interesting.
not 100% on board. It seemed a little, as reptile keepers, we're just always ready for the fight that somebody's trying to demonize a reptile,
Right.
no matter what. So it's, and I get it. They're not native, they're invasive and all that. But it felt sensational when I was reading it.
Yeah,
You know,
usually those mosquitoes have specific hosts that they like to feed off of. So, I mean, I'm sure there's probably a few species of mosquito that feed on both birds and lizards, but usually they would prefer just feeding off of birds or just feeding off of lizards. So it'd be hard to see. I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea, but I don't think, like you said, it's probably not going to turn out
yeah,
that way. But it is funny. I mean, I definitely think that, kind of like the, butterfly flaps its wings and creates a hurricane in another part of the world, that kind of thing, where these small changes and adding an invasive species or something can really affect the landscape and change things, is definitely, was borne out in a lot of ways. Like, obviously it's not great to have invasive species in the area where they don't belong, and cane toads have wreaked havoc on the reptile life of Australia. So I can only imagine how cool it would be to go to Darwin back, before cane toads were there, to see all the big monitor lizards and all that kind of stuff. But
and they've wreaked havoc because there are predators that are feeding on the cane toads and it's killing all the predators.
yeah, you don't get a second chance. You bite a cane toad and they're dead. So it's like,
Wow.
just rough. Now, that I guess that's definitely size dependent, and I think there are some examples of where they're rebounding, and the populations now don't even look at them as food. They know not to eat them, and
Wow.
and obviously that's how they co-evolved in their natural environment. Is things knew they were poisonous, so they're not there. You don't find a bunch of dead animals out in South America where they're from, or I think, yeah, that's where they come from, right? But they've learned that this is not a food item, or if you're going to eat it, flip it over on its back and eat it from the belly, because that's not where that's where the poison is not. So you can,
Wow.
and there's some animals that are resistant to the toxin. So like a keelback snake can eat a cane toad, but also keelback snakes are a smaller species, so they're not eating the big adult cane toads, which have the most poison. They're eating the juvenile cane toads with less poison. They're I think they're, and also some unintended consequences, like the pig-nosed turtles and crocodile populations have exploded because the monitor lizards would try to eat the cane toads and they'd die. And they're the major predators of pig-nosed turtle and crocodile eggs. And so when there's less monitor lizards, then your pig-nosed turtles and your crocodiles go up in their populations, which causes more problems for people in regards to crocodiles, because then there's more crocodiles out there and more chance of interaction between people and crocodiles. So just kind of one little thing can make a huge change when you introduce something that impacts the ecosystem like that. Now, I'm sure there's other examples where it's less, more inane, like maybe a chameleon being introduced into Florida or something, but you never know what the ultimate consequence is. So it's probably best not to introduce a species into a non-native environment. So,
and I mean, we're the king of invasive species, right? I mean, we alter our environments so dramatically. It's bizarre.
We bring the things that we want from our homeland of England or whatever. I want these starlings, so I'm going to bring them with me. And now starlings are everywhere, and they beat up other birds and take away their, kill their babies and stuff. So they can be a pretty nasty invasive species. My least favorite invasive species is probably cheatgrass. I hate that stuff.
I don't even know what that is.
Oh my gosh, it's this grass, and it has the seeds they have a point to them, and they actually like kind of embed themselves as you move into your socks. And so all of a sudden you're getting all these scratches on your ankles, and you look down and your socks are just full of cheatgrass seeds that are poking you. And it just takes over a landscape. So like southwestern Utah is just covered in cheatgrass, and so everywhere you go you're having to pull seeds out of your socks, and it's not great. I mean, I have seen desert tortoises feeding on it, so I mean something's eating it, but it can't be a great meal to have to eat those seeds and and there's not much to the plant other than those horrible seeds. I don't know. I curse them every time I walk through the desert in western Utah.
And the tortoises are probably making it worse. They're probably eating and then distributing the seeds, Well,
I don't know that they could make it worse. It's like everywhere. It just
really
covers the place. Yeah, it's terrible.
That's got to be like the pepper brush we have here in Florida. Yeah, but I mean, that's bananas because it's so tall, so it's killing the palmettos, like the scrub areas.
Yeah, I think everywhere's got their invasive plants, and plants are a little more insidious because you don't really think about them being, you look at it and it's green, so you don't really pay that much attention until you start losing your natural vegetation, and then you're like, wait a minute, this is not good.
Yeah. Or if you go into Google Earth and you look at your property, decades back, which I've done that before. And I'm like, wow, this used to look really different. Mm-hmm. But now we have all this pepper brush everywhere, and it's this huge tree that's just snuffing everything out around it.
Yeah. I don't know. Invasives are rough. I would love to see the world as it was, messed up by people, I guess.
Yeah. I would love to see the North American parrot. Was it a parrot or a parakeet? There was a North American parrot though that we pushed to
Carolina parakeet.
Yeah.
And I mean, they said the passenger pigeon used to darken the sky. There'd be millions of them flying overhead, and they're extinct now. Like we
used to have elk in Georgia.
Oh yeah. And I mean, we had wolves up here, and they were all extirpated, of course, and now they're trying to reintroduce them, but everybody freaks out because if they get out of Yellowstone or something and get onto somebody's ranch and kill a calf, then they're all of a sudden they need to shoot them, and so it's really it's a difficult struggle for, bringing things back or putting them back where they used to be, because some people don't want them back. They're happy they're gone. They're the reason they're gone to some extent. So yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. I think I was talking to Ron St. Pierre, and he was talking about how, people build houses which create these basically a rock structure, right? Like it's essentially a giant rock structure, and that's what attracts all the anoles and the agamas. Mm-hmm. They're going to live on and around houses because it's essentially a giant rocky structure. Yeah. And so, you might go into the woods and you're probably not going to find the anoles and the agamas as much because they're not getting what they want, where they get these basking platforms and all that. So it's kind of interesting how you get like an invasive habitat for invasive species, that are here in Florida. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, those disturbed habitats are sometimes even better for. I know, like the blood pythons, they find those in the plantations out in their natural environment, and like that second jungle carpet I found was in farmland. It was like cruising through fields, and disturbed habitat. There wasn't a rainforest to be seen, and so I mean, there's patches, and like you'll find these little islands of jungle, and then. There's some big areas of jungle, of course, like the Daintree is pretty untouched, but a lot of the area around Cairns was cut down for growing sugarcane. And I think, we see that like a lot of this monoculture where they're cutting down primary forests to grow, palm, for palm oil. Yeah. So they're just planting just those palm trees. And so some species might be able to adapt, like the blood pythons, but others go extinct because they don't have their primary forest, and they can't survive in a palm plantation.
Did I read that jungle carpet pythons have lost like 90% of their habitat or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, we included a map in the more complete carpet python that shows how the jungle carpet python habitat has changed, or how their primary forest is diminished over the last several decades. And
it's so depressing.
Yeah, it's hard. Now I see other stories, like there's that guy in India that planted a whole forest. He just did it tree by tree over his lifetime, and now there's this thriving rainforest, where it was completely cut down. And so I read somewhere too that the Amazon rainforest is human introduced to some extent.
Yeah. I've heard that it's
that it was planted. It's a garden or something, and so I think we can make a positive impact. It's just when we get focused on money, it's easier just to clear cut something and then let your cattle graze and then sell your cattle and make more money, and instead of collecting rainforest fruits or something, or leading tourism groups or something, which would probably be better in the long run. But I guess it's easier because we know how to raise cattle. So we're just going to clear the forest and grow our cows, and so people can eat their McDonald's burgers or whatever.
I hope that there's more. I hope that there's been more initiatives, recently to protect the wildlife in Australia and the forests and things like that. I would hope it's gotten better.
Yeah. I mean, Australia does have a lot of national parks and national forests and state forests and things like that. And I think overall, people are moving towards that. I mean, Utah's we've got lots of national parks and national monuments and state parks and things. I do worry, it depends on the administration too, because Obama protected a great area of desert habitat with the Bears Ears, and then Trump got in and removed all those protections, and then mining companies come in and start drilling, and then I think Biden restored it. Now Trump's going to take it away. It just kind of goes back and forth depending on who's in office, and and I get it. We need to mine some places, and we need to do these, but it's just hard when there's things that can't be replaced. These beautiful environments, and I don't know. It's a tricky balance because, I do enjoy having a cell phone, and I'm sure that cell phone battery came from, the lithium or whatever that was mined for that battery came from some beautiful habitat somewhere. And we gotta take some things, or I do like that. Hopefully, technology advances to where we don't necessarily need to use those rare metals and things like that. But we'll see. I don't know.
All right. Well, we'll wrap this up real quick. The Serpento virus. Has there been any? I mean, it'd be so wrong if I had you on and I didn't ask you about a virus. Are there any advances with the Serpento virus? How does it present itself in animals, or could you have an animal where it doesn't present itself and it might spread to another animal where it then all of a sudden you see that it's degrading their health dramatically? Have we made any advances with that?
Yeah, that's one of the things I think that we don't have a firm grip on, is exactly, where they came from, if they originated in the species that they caused the severe disease in, or for example, a serpentovirus came in with a wild Papuan carpet, and it was not negatively impacting the Papuan carpet, but they kept it in a cage next to a green tree green tree python, and the green tree got it and got a severe, lethal disease. We don't know if that's the case, or if, it's just because usually, I mean, we saw this with the SARS-2, the COVID virus, where initially as it spread and the initial outbreak resulted in millions and millions of people dying from the virus. Now, as the virus has changed and mutated over time, it's become less pathogenic. Less people are dying now. More people are still getting COVID, but it's not life-threatening anymore. It's just become a normal seasonal, like the flu, where you're just going to feel sick and you're going to go back to work in a few days.
Are
So
people still getting like myocarditis and everything from COVID? Like, is it still causing like those after effects?
I'm sure it is in some people, but it's not as common as was previously observed. Now, it's hard to say too, because, it's like, when it goes through, it's obviously taking out the people who are more susceptible and people who have underlying health conditions and things like that. But typically viruses tend to trend to evolve into a less lethal state, less pathogenic, and more just normal, where you may not even notice you have it. And most viruses cause, especially viruses that are people viruses, that infect people as their primary host, they don't usually kill you. They just replicate and pass on to somebody else. If a virus killed its host before it could be passed on to somebody else, then it would go extinct pretty quick, and so that's kind of the idea here, is we don't know if it originated in in certain species and it's just bad sometimes in certain individuals, or if it's a boa virus that jumped to pythons and causes a really bad disease in pythons, and it doesn't cause much disease in boas because it evolved in boas, something like that. We do know, though, that there have been some wild outbreaks of different similar viruses. There was one in shingleback skinks, and they were finding all these shingleback skinks that had terrible respiratory disease, and they were dying. Typically, serpentoviruses present as a bad respiratory infection, and there will be lots of mucus, lots of difficulty for the animal breathing and things like that. So I'm sure they've been around for longer than we've known about them, because we've only recently been able to better identify novel viruses in systems. It's surprisingly difficult to do that unless you have funding and unless you have motivation and things like that to look and see what that is. Because I mean, most people could give a crap about a virus that kills snakes. They probably would welcome that, so we're the only ones that are like, hey, no, we don't want this, and they're like, this is a good thing. So I don't know.
Tragedy for us.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to say, and I think that's difficult to kind of trace where, and those kind of things, because it's just difficult to do, especially when you have an international trade of all these animals coming into one facility and then distributing all over the United States and things like that. So and where there just isn't funding or interest for the most part to look into that, it's even more difficult to figure out where that came from. But the situation we're in is we have these different serpentoviruses, and some may cause more disease in certain species and less in others. Who knows? Maybe they're completely undetectable in certain ones, and if they jump to a new host, then all of a sudden you might have what's called a carrier state, where they have the virus, the virus produces actively in them, but they don't show the disease, and so you don't know you have a diseased snake, and then all of a sudden other animals in your collection start getting sick and start dying. And I've heard of people's collections completely being decimated by serpentoviruses. So they're not just I mean, I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, they're no big deal. It's not that big a deal," but it is a big deal for certain things. For some people and some collections, it's been catastrophic. So, to say that they shouldn't be a cause of concern. Now, we can also go the other way, and one snake has the sniffles, so you euthanize your whole collection. I think that might be going a little too far.
Yeah.
And as far as research I've done, we looked at different antivirals that work against a wide range of virus, and showed some activity of some of these antivirals to treat serpentoviruses, but it's only in cell culture. We haven't done that in an animal model. And that's probably the next step to look at, is to develop an animal model that develops the disease, and then be able to treat those animals and see if you can prevent disease or cure disease after they've become symptomatic, which is when you'd bring your animal to the vet or whatever.
So you go to work and play with serpentovirus and then come home to your collection?
Well, this was actually kind of a short stint. We actually just did 1 or 2 studies. We got some funding actually from a carpet fest that
oh, nice.
I think it was the Florida Carpet Fest even, and they raised some money for serpentovirus research, and they gave some to my university, and they gave some to the University of Florida, and they did some studies there, and we published a paper together with those guys. They were the ones that kind of identified the viruses, characterized them, grew them up in cell culture. Then they sent them to us. We grew them up in their cells, and then we treated them with antivirals and showed that they could be, we could prevent infection with these antivirals.
So it might not be a death sentence after all?
Yeah. I mean, there may, we did identify a couple that could potentially treat them, so more work would need to be done to see if that's the case. But, and I did hear rumors of some work that's either been done and is being published, or that got, out there somehow, that temperature, raising the temperature for a certain amount of time to a certain level would get rid of the virus. And so that's a possibility as well. So maybe that's coming down the pipe, I hope, because that would be an easy answer to the problem. If you could just
do a little
raise the
sauna
temperature.
treatment.
Yeah, exactly. And then that would cure it. That would be an easy solution to the problem. But
wow. That's awesome.
We'll see. Yeah.
Man. Well, so the future's bright. So
yeah. I mean, I think there's always reasons to be hopeful for the future. I mean, there's a lot of people who get pretty bummed out when they think about the future, but I'm usually an optimist and think that there are some good things coming down the pike, and life can be good.
Well, yeah. I mean, IBD used to be like I have friends that won't keep boas because they're afraid of IBD, but it doesn't seem like it's as prevalent as it used to be.
Yeah,
I mean, accurate, or is it still running rampant?
I think it's still out there. I mean, I was in a pet store in California. It was a terrible pet store. I shouldn't even gone inside, but I saw some boa that was like stargazing, and it looked bad and was emaciated, and they had it like reduced price, to sell it easy. I'm like, come on, people, what are we doing here? It's just
that's
terrible.
A nightmare.
So, yeah, I don't know who's buying stuff from that pet store, but I guess, when you first get into the hobby, you might not have that awareness, and you might make those. I mean, when I started, I got a bearded dragon, right? That was one of my first breeding projects. It was kind of an on accident. There was this great reptile shop near me, and I saw this bearded dragon like digging, and it was very fat, and it was in with a bunch of other bearded dragons. So I'm like, I'll buy that one. And I took it home, and it laid eggs, and I hatched the eggs out and sold the eggs back to the pet store for like $50 a pop. And I'm like, nice. Oh, this is a great way to, to make a little side money when I'm very poor in, school. And so I started buying bearded dragons, and the more dragons I bought, the worse I did, because I picked up some from just random shops that had like pinworms or had some kind of parasites. And one by one, I just watched my collection just fail, stop laying eggs, stop doing anything productive. And so I ended up like selling them or losing some, that kind of thing. And so it's like, oh man, I should have been smarter about this. I should have thought about who I'm purchasing from, what the source of the animals are, and I think sometimes we're just desperate to get the animals, or they're on sale because they have IBD or whatever. It's like you make some poor choices sometimes, but I think, if we learn those lessons the hard way sometimes, and hopefully people will avoid that if they listen to this, and they can say, I'm going to do a better job of doing my background check if I'm going to buy an animal. But
so what do you do when you get a new python in? How are you testing it for serpentovirus?
I don't usually bring in much. I kind of have a closed collection for the most part, but I will. So I'm a little on the fence with the testing, because either there's nothing you can do about it. Either you're going to euthanize it, and I don't necessarily think I'm going to euthanize an animal if it tests positive for a virus. The other side is, like, I guess knowing gives you a workflow, where you can work with that animal last, or work with it on a different day and different clothes and things like that. So you're not passing it on to your animal. So I think there is some benefit of knowing if it's serpentovirus or not. Otherwise, like, if I have an animal that has a respiratory infection, I treat it like it is serpentovirus, or any other disease I don't want to spread to my other animals. So I'll work with it last, or use different tools with that animal, or that kind of thing. So I do think there is some benefit to knowing. Now, testing all the animals in my collection would be cost prohibitive, so I haven't tested all my stuff for serpentovirus, but I don't know that I would necessarily say that's probably the best way to go, unless you have a smaller collection and it's manageable. But yeah, if you get a new snake and you do a serpentovirus test, or actually ask the breeder if there's any kind of need for that. I've started buying from people that I know and trust, that I'm not gonna, that they're not gonna sell me a sick animal, that they're gonna, or, but I think I have too much stuff already, so I don't really need to buy more, but I probably should get rid of more. But, I guess that's kind of my thoughts on it is, there's, hopefully in the next little while, we'll hear about something that can help us cure our animals of serpentovirus. But in the meantime, the only thing you can do is kind of either euthanize the animal, or have a workflow where you work with that animal last and you keep it separate, keep it in a different room if you can. And
maybe keep it a little hotter.
Yeah.
See if it helps. So. All right. Well, Justin, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I watched your, I think I was introduced to you on YouTube with your Antaresia kind of TED Talk.
Oh, okay.
That's out there. And that
that was the Herpeton that, that Alan Rapace put on with Philippe Devogely.
Yeah, that was
great, fantastic. Thing. Yeah. It's too bad that ended with COVID, but hopefully they're going to get it going again. But yeah,
it's time. I gotta get your, do you have, well, we'll talk off air, but I want to see if you have any copies of, the Antaresia book, signed. I'd love to get a copy from you.
Yeah, I think there's a box right here that I still have.
Oh, hell yeah.
In there, yeah.
You're like, what do you think I'm sitting on?
Yeah, this room, if you could see, it's just like books piled everywhere. And
I see that.
Yeah, so there's boxes of books down here, but I keep most of them in my office at work, but I have like 3 or 4 copies in my office, and then I'll have backups here. So yeah, should have the books I've got, but yeah.
Right on. Well, thank you, sir. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Good to chat with you. Good to be your idiot today.
Hey, wait, no, it's the other way around.
Thanks, man.